Hello! You're watching another episode of BagelCast. This time with the same crew. We have myself, Chris, and we have Wyatt Claypool from the National Telegraph. We're carrying on a little bit from last month when we were talking about stuff voter choice theory, but today we're going to focus specifically on a recent thing that's popped up where a bunch of NDP MPs have all announced that they're not going to run again. We have Charlie Angus, Carl Hughes, and Rachel Blaney from Timmins James Bay, Ogloma Mantle and Capos Casing, and North Island Power will just announced on April 4th. They're not running, bringing up to about 5 NDP MPs who aren't running again, all in actually very crucial ridings for them.
And the thing is too is that it's not just those three. They've already had two people since I believe the first one was on April 27th of last year who said that they weren't running. And like you could say a few defections, that's kind of normal for any political party between races. But considering that like a good chunk of the MPs saying that they're not going to run again are NDP is significant since they only have 25 seats in Parliament right now altogether, and only two conservatives are saying they're not going to run again, and most of those are due to, I believe, old age, not because people just genuinely just didn't think they believed in the party's message anymore. And so when legitimately like a good third of the people not running for in the next election are NDP, that's a sign that the polling that's showing the NDP punching into the low 20s might not be as accurate as their internal numbers are telling them.
Yeah, it's also quite telling with this too, because some of these MPs are not even particularly old. It's also not captured here too, because there's another MP, uh, David Blakey in Elmwood Transcona, resigned his seat as well, which putting it up to 6 of the NDP MPs are just not going to be running again. And Daniel Blakey's not old. Like, he's not retiring from old age.
Yeah, you
He's
could give it to you could give that excuse for the first two who said they weren't going to run, Randall Garrison and Richard Cannings. Randall Garrison 73, Richard Cannings is 70. I could see it maybe, although 70 is not that old in Canadian politics. Like nobody ever gets to 80 in Canadian politics, but you'd have one more run in you, and if it's a tough election, you think you would stick around to hold up that seat. But when these people are thinking it's not worth it, that's they're basically saying it's not worth voting for the party if it's not worth running for them again, when many of these guys already have their pensions and they could just do it for fun.
yeah, and it's quite significant for the NDP as well because, for example, let's pick Charlie Angus. Charlie Angus, he's not young, but he's not that old. Like, he doesn't need to retire. There's no reason why, after 20 years, now is the point that he has to throw in the towel. But him throwing in the towel is a really big deal electorally because the what is Timmins James right now is going to be different after April 24th when the new map comes into effect, which you have all been seeing on my channel. But that riding is only narrowly going NDP right now within a long term incumbent. You lose a long term incumbent in a riding like Timmins James Bay, that's really devastating for your chances of continuing to hold that riding. Same thing with Carol Hughes and Algoma Mantle and Capu Casing. That's a huge loss for the NDP.
And the problem they're having in these ridings especially is the fact that these are ridings where often it's a three-way split between all of the major parties, conservatives, liberals, and NDP. And so that incumbent advantage, that personality on the ballot, helps out a lot, because it's not where if Charlie Angus drops off the ballot, it's a normal NDP versus conservative or an NDP versus liberal riding where it's technically a 50-50. It's like a presidential race. It's a coin toss on who's going to win. Yes, being an incumbent helps, but it's either you or the other guy. They have many options in these ridings. I believe actually in Timmins James Bay with Charlie Angus, like the Greens punch 8-10%. And so this is a riding where you definitely need like an edge factor on why you should vote for that party, especially when the NDP is not even going to be the main opposition. They were the main opposition once in 2011, and that's it. It's going to be a massive majority for the Conservatives in the 2025 election. And I think that really the funny thing is looking at the behavior of Charlie Angus over the past few months leading up to this, this announcement that he's not going to run again. It's like he was trying to gird up his legacy right at the last moment because he knows that there's nothing else he can do in office. So while he has, the ear of Parliament being in a coalition government with the Liberals, I know it's not a coalition government, but that's effectively what it is that Charlie Angus is throwing out his ridiculous, I think it's Bill 375, Private Members Bill 372, trying to ban pro-oil and gas advocacy speech. I think he knew it was ridiculous, but it's a way of, that's the kind of thing that everyone's going to remember Charlie Angus for. Because other than that, you would just say he's kind of a generic progressive union activist.
And I just pulled up the numbers for my model on this one, just for sake of example. So what will become the new Timmins Capus casing Mushkagowuk? I really apologize for the pronunciation.
BC riding names are impossible. They trip me up, and it's like with Quebec ridings and those ones. If it's not something simple like Mount Royal, I'm like, it's look it up.
But that riding, as of when I just ran the numbers recently, the Conservatives are only down 2.3 percentage points, which means that once you actually factor in an election with a new face, which is not, like, my model sort of bakes in, but it's kind of hard to project how much an incumbent is worth, if that makes sense. Yeah. This is probably almost an auto-conservative flip. Assuming nothing massive changes.
There's no sort of political culture shift in Canadian politics right now that would make me expect that any Liberal in that riding would have momentum. It's a riding where I don't believe Liberals have really ever won it, or at least they haven't won it in a very long time. But there's enough of a Liberal base that they can place into the 20s in terms of the popular vote. But it's a working class Northern Ontario riding, so it tends to map a little bit closer to Conservatives and NDP, which is why those two parties are the ones who have historically had the easiest chance winning it. And now, I think Charlie Angus had already betrayed a lot of his working class base, because it might not be an oil and gas riding, but there's sort of a working class sympathy for the oil and gas industry in Canada. So he was already hurting himself there. And now you're going to swap it out with probably someone that Jagmeet Singh tends to prefer over Charlie Angus, because as much as it's hard to believe when you look at the stuff that Charlie Angus says and does, he is more on the union side of the sort of the NDP. He's an old Labour NDP MP. And so by swapping him out with probably someone who's more public sector union progressive, that's auto going to go to the Conservatives, because the Conservatives have been really leaning into that kind of, hard scrabble life narrative about Canada and how we have to give more not benefits, but we have to give more respect back to those who actually work hard for a living.
Yeah, and it actually kind of goes into something that several union guys have been telling me. One notable guy, Matt Beastity, comments all the time. He works in the maritime industry, so on shipping, and the NDP is doing all sorts of things to fundamentally lose this demographic by just not doing it. So the big example he was giving me is there was a bunch of big strikes last year in like port authorities and like the St. Lawrence canalways. And the NDP, like, Singh didn't go to any of those strikes, even symbolically, for a photo op. And that is really pissed off a lot of guys in his industry. A lot of people he works with are really mad that the NDP didn't even show up. The working class union party did not show up to union strikes. And it's not just that particular industry and that particular example. All sorts of union guys I know are saying the exact same thing. The NDP is just, they don't care anymore about the unions, other than the public sector guys.
And to a certain extent, they sort of do still care about them. And in the sense that I don't think that Jagmeet Singh has had a massive ideological shift against trade unions and whatnot. It's a trade unionist party. That is what they're based on. I think it's just a personality thing with Jagmeet Singh, that he finds private sector union members kind of grubby. They work in dirty jobs. I don't care. They don't believe in the same things I do. They don't listen to the same music. I think it's that shallow overall, because and I'm not trying to bring his wife into it for no reason. But when you look at the TikToks of Jagmeet Singh and his wife, like I don't use TikTok, I just see some that get reposted to X, but like she's like showing off her $20,000 worth of jewelry in TikTok videos, and he is like wearing a Rolex and cooking with this very expensive copper cookware and whatnot. It's like he doesn't like going down to some sort of, you know, protest where everyone's like a hardworking steel mill person working on the cars in Oshawa and Hamilton wearing heavy windbreakers and smoking. That's not his crowd. Not that that's like the stereotype of any public sector union worker. That's the image that he sees in his mind. He says, well, I want to hang out with like the teachers and I want to hang out with the people who work at government offices. That's his crowd. People who go to cocktail parties on Saturdays.
In a sense, he's kind of like a champagne train unionist.
He's like Lenin, frankly. He actually, honestly, is very much based in the. He's very much part of the history of communists, being people who actually don't like working class people. They just like sitting around philosophizing and, you know, sitting around coffee shops, acting like the smartest person in the room.
So, what I think this all really boils down to, like, because a lot of polls, we bring up just the polls here. So you look at back through January here. So the NDP have been hovering around 20 plus or minus 2, give or take, up until March. In March, we've had a couple polls like this Main Street poll at 15 and the last Ledger poll at 17 that are a bit lower than that range. But for the most part, they've been sitting around 20 plus or minus 2. And I think between these defections and these some underlying momentums with like the trade union guys I've been talking about, I think there's no way that these poll numbers are entirely accurate. And I don't think it's necessarily that the pollsters are wrong. Like, I don't think they're doing anything wrong. I think it's people haven't genuflected yet about this. I don't think this is what the result's going to be on election day, anywhere close to this. I think the NDP are going to start plummeting in the near future. Because a lot of these things aren't fully bubbled through the populace yet, from what I've surveyed and talking to people in real life. And so what I'm thinking that's going to happen here is that the NDP is going to fall hard. So if you remember back to the last episode, there was a last Angus Reid poll or back in January, I believe, that had, let's see if I can bring it up here.
Well, I remember, I think that was February, where they were actually basically within the margin of error of the federal Liberals. And what you're getting at, or I assume you're getting at, is that the thing with the NDP is that, and this might be more of a polling error on the polling firm side, it's not intentional, but I think that it's that the NDP on a provincial level has a good brand in a lot of people's minds. It's associated positively. But when you attach Jagmeet Singh's NDP to it, a lot of people then pull back. So it depends on how you pull it. That's how you'll get people to respond. But the NDP, especially in the 21 election, same with the PPC, would heavily overpoll what they were actually capable of driving the vote out for. Because when you look at fundraising, this is where fundraising numbers do come into play heavily. Money is not everything in politics. Very much the party that spends the most doesn't always win. Different parties need different amounts of money to run successful campaigns. The Conservatives always need way more money than the Liberals because they run in much more geographically spread out ridings, and they run effectively seriously in every single province, where the Liberals don't seriously run in every province. But with the NDP, they don't have the money to actually get out the vote, so they pick and choose what ridings they're going to compete for. And if they pick wrong, they end up with like way fewer seats, or if they pick right, they end up with way more seats. And so that's where the popular vote never comes in for them, because they don't have the money to go into ridings that they know they're not going to win and at least spend enough for a good showing. They only either show up to win or they don't show up.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. So I just brought up the poll here that I was referring to. We talked about it last.
You might have to show it on screen for me. I don't see it yet.
Oh, one momento. Here we go. So this poll had suggested that 7% of the NDP at the time in early January were going to switch Liberal to vote if the Conservatives could win. Now, I think that polling question is bad, and I don't think actually 7% are going to join the Liberals. I think the Liberals are going to get to 31%, 34% range. But what I think
this last episode,
yeah.
people can go look that up if they want that very much in detail.
Yeah, but I think what the core here is, what I think is really important, is this 13%, 14%, this is actually what the core current Jagmeet Singh NDP is. And it has some percentage of people who aren't core NDP, but they're currently leaning NDP because they don't really like the other options. But then when you actually add in what Wyatt just said with the lack of fundraising, which is a chronic problem for the Singhian NDP, and the get out the vote efforts, with the NDP have historically been quite bad at get out the vote. I think, one, you're going to see a lot of these people just not get turned out or just not bother voting. But also, a lot of them are going to end up defecting Liberal in ridings or defecting Conservative closer to election day because the NDP's going nowhere. Because the thing that some people complain about this in like really big detail.
In BC, I think they'll actually they'll do closer to what their current numbers are in British Columbia if David Eby doesn't get bested by the BC Conservatives, because the David Eby is actually kind of standing in solidarity with Jagmeet Singh. And I think this is kind of the interesting story of Jagmeet Singh and the NDP over the last couple of years. Wab Kinew met with Jagmeet Singh third out of the federal leaders. He met with Justin Trudeau and then Pierre Poilievre. And then just like 2 days ago, he finally met with Jagmeet Singh. And the Saskatchewan NDP didn't want him to show up to their convention. And I think it's because he's bad for the provincial NDP brand. So I think in provinces where the NDP don't want to associate with him, that's the places where they're going to have volunteers staying home, because the provincial party said, yeah, just don't show up. Please don't, because we don't want people comparing us to him. And we'd actually like to see him go if we actually hope to win a provincial election.
And there's a certain thing that people, like, it is true, this does happen. It's called the bandwagon effect, and some people really get bent out of shape over it and want to ban polls because of it, but it's basically negligible. But
people figure out who's the main contenders in their area anyways.
Like, it doesn't, it sort of happens, but it's so negligible it doesn't actually change the effect of elections. But there is an effect where people seeing that their party is going to lose, and then they're not going to vote as much or be as willing to go out to vote. Now, if you have a good get out the vote effort and a good team and you have the funding, you can turn out those people anyways because they already lean towards you. But if you're lacking money, you're lacking motivation, you have negative momentum nationally, and your polling is tanking, the voters aren't going to go vote as much because they don't think there's no point. That's kind of what happened in 2022 in Ontario. And you saw with the turnout. The turnout plummeted, largely likely because voters saw that there was no point in it, that Ford was going to win, and the opposition had no good, obvious get out the vote, or good, well-organized get out the vote to get it. And that's
what's happening in British Columbia right now. David Eby and his NDP, like his BC NDP, are not actually that popular when you dig into some of the polls that come out. When you start to ask people what they think on this policy and that policy, they're like straight across the board in the negatives in terms of their approval on policy, and like deeply in the negatives. Just look at the provincial carbon tax, something that's been around forever in BC, like since 2008 or whatever. That policy polls at like 29% of people wanting to actually keep the provincial carbon tax in place. I believe like 57% or so want to get rid of it. That is horrifying for a government that is supposedly way ahead in the polls. I think they're ahead in the polls partially because of the bandwagon effect, because if the United and the BC Conservatives aren't going to get their acts together, well, I might as well vote for the guy who's going to win, because then I can, people are very strange. They're like, well, I want to vote for the guy who won so I can tell him I voted for him or whatever, or maybe I can, endear myself to him. You want to ingratiate yourself in some abstract way to whoever is going to represent your area. But if the BC Conservatives consolidate the United's polling into theirs, or their support into their support, and they can claw away a few BC NDP supporters now, I think you'll actually see a massive shift in line with what voters actually think of David Eby and their policies.
And that's where a lot of this, for the NDP in particular, where the Singh's weakness on a federal level is quite dangerous, is because, as you mentioned, Eby's pretty much the only leader provincially who's standing with Singh. And there's a very high possibility, even though BC, the NDP do usually quite well there, that this could backfire because voters don't like Singh. He kind of has the advantage in a lot of opinion polls that he polls better in them than a lot of people, than he really frankly should. And that's really because a lot of people don't.
He's harmless to them.
Yes, that's what I was trying to say. People don't negatively or disapprove of someone they think is irrelevant. People, like, the reason why Trudeau is so unpopular and Singh is, like, neutral in the last Abacus polls is not because Singh is loved or better liked than Trudeau. It's just conservatives consider Trudeau a threat because he can win elections and do things. They don't consider Singh a threat. So they're not very worried about it. That's kind of the
funny relationship with popularity in the NDP leaders. The more they actually see of the NDP leader, the more they tend to not like them. So the more Singh has been relevant to the goings-on in politics, the more his approval rating has plummeted. Where I find then the default for the Liberals is that if nothing crazy is going on, people tend to like them. Conservatives are then always kind of fighting negative public opinion because I wouldn't say that even Canada's a center-left default country, but I would say that it's very much the places that are center-left are super polarized against conservatives, where I find that you're actually much more willing to run into conservative Canadians willing to say, Chrétien was a good guy. Trudeau at the start of his tenure was okay. Whereas I always find because of media coverage, there's a lot, like, conservatives have to tend to fight the idea that they're not bad people. Whereas Liberals get the benefit of the doubt, and the same thing, as long as people don't really know too much about the NDP leader, they're assuming that, he's probably doing his job.
So we have here, I brought up the Abacus polling trends for Jagmeet Singh's approval. So back in March 22, he's somewhere around 26 disapprove, 41 approve, and that's when the supply and confidence agreement is signed. And that put him from being kind of an irrelevant third party who's just kind of there into actually someone who's just propping up Trudeau, overtly and clearly propping up Trudeau. And then we can kind of see since then, the trend line is very clear. He's just losing more and more support.
The trend even started before that, because as people can see on screen, he used to have a 46% approval, 22% negative impression, it's because leading up to that, people kind of saw the agreement coming, and he was starting to enter into discussions with Justin Trudeau, and then when he signed it, he was at 41, and then it started dropping off there. Also, just a side note, for anyone ever looking up leader approval ratings, I think Abacus data is the standard for approval ratings of politicians. I'm not sure about your opinion on this, Chris, but I don't like it when they do somewhat approve, strongly approve, somewhat disapprove, strongly disapprove. Either you like the guy or you don't. I find sometimes actually the middle road answers, it just tends to be when the person has nothing good to say, they'll say somewhat approve, where it's really that either you're neutral on them, you like them, or you don't like them. And I think it cuts to the chase. So everyone's approvals, when you get rid of those somewhat approve options, they significantly, I find, lean more negative the way I think people actually think about politics.
Yeah, I think I entirely agree with you there. The general rule of thumb to me is that feelings should not be quantified by more than 3 options. And those 3 options are no opinion, dislike, like.
When you're maybe like actually polling people in a specific interest group on a policy, that's when it can get complicated. Really, it's kind of vibes with the general public on general questions. That's where, in a certain sense, like sometimes you need more detail, sometimes you don't. Like what I was just saying with the NDP, I think if you mention the fact it's Jagmeet Singh's NDP, people won't start thinking Rachel Notley, they won't start thinking Wab Kinew or Andrea Horvath in their minds, and then artificially vote NDP because they vote them provincially. And there's actually, when I go door knocking in my riding of Calgary Signal Hill, every once in a while, because NDP is considered like the other party provincially, tons of people say, "Oh, I know bio like the NDP. I don't want to sign up and be a conservative member." And I ask them out of pure curiosity. I even usually say that out of pure curiosity, since I'm a journalist. Do you like the federal NDP? They're like, "Oh no, I actually vote Liberal federally. I don't like Jagmeet." And there's so many people who are like that. They think he's just kind of some rich ponce who doesn't understand them.
And this is another interesting thing, but which you can gather from something like an abacus approval rating thing, is there's an interesting trend here, which it's easier to see with that mostly affects conservatives, and any kind of approval that is done in this matter that's yes, no opinion, negative, will display this. It doesn't work well with like Main Street, because Main Street will have strongly approve, somewhat approve, etc. That doesn't translate very well. But in an abacus style question, there is this trend among conservatives, for various reasons, that they will overperform their vote intention based on the leader approval. So the leader approval for Poilievre right now is about 38%. So they will always overperform that. That 38% is the baseline for the Conservatives. They will never underperform that 38% in how the electoral system works. Whereas if you look at the NDP, their 33% has almost no relation to their vote share. You go back up to Trudeau, this 25%, though, it sort of does have a relation. And the reason for that relation is a lot of Liberals approve of Singh.
If you scroll up probably on this exact poll and look at what the Liberals have in the actual polling nationally, I found, and I always mention this in my videos on polling, it's almost within 1% of the Liberals' actual turnout. Yeah, it's 24%. Actually, it's interesting that they score the same on male and female now. But yeah, so it's 24% nationally. And in this poll, he has his 25% approval rating. Mm-hmm. I have never seen his approval rating stray from their national polling by more than 1 or 2%.
Same thing with the government approval for the Liberals, too. It's usually within 1 or 2%. And as long as it's asked in this style of question, if you ask it in the Main Street style or other companies' style, you're going to get a different result. But any poll that is yes, no, no opinion, it's going to be very similar. And I can't like verbatim tell you that this is actual fact. This is just an observation I've seen. But my theory behind this observation is the mainstream left-wing party, the leader's approval and their vote is pretty similar. Because if anyone doesn't like the leader, they're not going to vote for that party because of how left-wing government works and the organization works. There tends to be
a lot of also mainstream media positive propaganda around liberal leaders, where every time there's a conservative leader, they're dark, they're insular, untransparent, uncaring. So when you see Pierre Poilievre, right when he becomes the new leader, I think this was going all the way back to, is this last year? Or I think this was actually even before he was leader. But even before he's leader and then right after he's leader, immediately there's a high negative impression. Unjustifiably, people who probably don't even know anything about him, but he's a conservative leader. He's a nasty, uncaring, unfeeling person, so I don't like him. And so that's what's usually reflected in the polls. That's why it's the conservative always having to push back against default negative opinions from the public. And so a 38-34, as we see right now when was last taken, very good, honestly, very good rating for him right now. In March. That because that's put like the fact that you have a positive rating as a conservative, you also shouldn't dwell too much on your approval ratings. But this is generally you have to almost unskew approval rating polls when it comes to the different parties. We tend to recommend, and I think you'd agree, don't try and unskew polls because you can get any reading out of a poll if you unskew it. On this front, you can actually through social data figure out what's really going on here. But this is also the problem with so many conservative leaders in the past, is that Aaron O'Toole and Andrew Scheer and a little bit of Harper towards the end started trying to win the approval game, and it just doesn't work because that is an uphill battle. That doesn't matter. There's a lot of people willing to say that you seem like a not so nice person, but they're still going to vote for your policies because they're logical. And so you shouldn't be trying to win the approval game, because to win the approval game, you're going to have to gut your own policy book.
Yes, and and I was going to touch on this, but one of the big reasons, in my experience as both political analyst, history, working and doing things in politics, and that a lot of conservative right-wing people in general have a very friendly relationship with open critique of somebody. So they might despise their leader. They will still vote for them because that is either what they're supposed to do, because they're in the party, I have to vote for my guy, or it's just the rational thing to do. They're the least bad option. I like 2021. A lot of people hated O'Toole in the conservative movement. They still voted for O'Toole because he was the least worst option. And that's why conservative approval numbers asked in this format will always lag their vote intention, because there's a large percentage of people who are right wing who do not like their leader but will vote anyways because that is either what they're supposed to do or that's what their faction says. They're very, for example, in Poilievre's case, it's very likely a lot of red Tory types in the Conservative Party don't particularly like Poilievre. But they're almost certainly going to vote for him because all of the red Tories in the country, all the leaders in the caucus, the Rampel Garniers and some even say like Michael Chong's and stuff, they're going to vote for him. They're going to campaign for him.
This is a good example because he's leaving in my area. Like Ron Liepert. Ron Liepert hates Poilievre so much. I know that people say that he goes around saying he likes Trudeau better than Poilievre. That actually might have influenced him, saying that he wasn't going to run again.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that the funny thing is actually here's a good story that I've heard from behind the scenes in the Conservative caucus that is very indicative of not playing the stupid media game. Not the stupid media game in the sense that, he's breaking the playbook or something like that. But up until Pierre Poilievre was running for leadership, I've heard that he wasn't very well liked in caucus. And you shouldn't take that as a negative thing. It's because he's not the type of person to buy other MPs a drink after work. He's not the type of person who buys you sends you the card on your birthday and whatnot. It's because he works with you, and that's kind of it. And people are like, well, he's not friendly. He's not a team player. He kind of does his own thing. And it's like, well, yeah, it's because he's trying to win voters, not random insider MPs and, parliamentary staffers. That's not his game. And that's why Aaron O'Toole ends up alienating his bases, because he's trying to keep singular votes on side with people who work at, the National Post and the Toronto Sun, keep those people in line with him, keep staffers saying nice things about him while he's losing, the gun owners, while he's losing the people who are pro-life, while he's losing all these people on his left, on his right, and even sometimes his left flank.
And that's where the need to understand what right-wing approval numbers mean in Canada really comes in. Because what O'Toole was doing, as Wyatt saying, is he was looking at his numbers. I want to see if I can actually bring up a poll. His 1 second. But he would be looking at his polling numbers, and they would be bad. Like, he wasn't liked. And then he was, in efforts to try to fix that, he was changing his policies. He was trying to change the relationship with things. Okay, here we go. We have O'Toole here. This is right before the election. He has a 12-point gap here. So what he's trying to do is he's trying to change his policies as they are to appeal to people, but he's blindly doing it because he thinks that the people who don't like him are the liberal types because of probably too much focus grouping. And focus grouping can work, don't get me wrong, but you have to be very careful with focus grouping because the people you put in the focus group, if they're the wrong people, you're going to get the wrong answers from them. But he was trying to do things that make himself look more liberal, more safe, more generic. Because that's what he thought why people didn't like him. They thought he was too rough or something. And that's why, famously in 2021, during the election, he walked away from his gun platform. For no particular reason. And that is why he actually loses approval rating. Why he is doing terrible. Because at the end of the day, the people who didn't like O'Toole were actually the right wing of the party.
The funny thing with conservative voters, too, is that it's kind of like, it's almost reversed. This is kind of the funny thing. The Liberals have very concentrated votes in the country. Eastern Canada, the GTA, Montreal, around Vancouver, a lot of other sort of small Liberal communities or sort of concentrated ridings in Calgary and Edmonton they can sometimes win. But the thing is that they work with a very broad sort of general group of people maybe willing to vote for them, and that's why they tend to have very high, almost artificially boosted approval ratings. So there's a big portion of people that they can work with in these concentrated areas where that actually matters. But with conservatives, they work with a very concentrated national profile of a person who might vote for them, but they can find these people in every riding because they're, even though they're niche categories, they're categories you can kind of find anywhere. Outside of like rural areas where it's just that's just type of voter who votes for them, and it's super general, and they don't have to, they cater to them, but they don't have to cater that much because they're just generally on board with their agenda. But that's where O'Toole started like almost going against the way that you win an election as a conservative. It's almost kind of like vote bank politics, but not in the negative way that you usually think of, like, you pander to a specific ethnic community based on very niche issues that really shouldn't matter in this country. Maybe it's like gun owners. If you are good on guns, they will show up. If you're good on at least giving pro-life voters some latitude to have a voice in parliament, they'll show up. And I think that although conservatives don't really have any other option except for the PPC in 21, which did take away a significant amount of votes, they mostly stick around still. But the thing is that you're maybe only getting 70% of that community to show up. But if you say the right things, 100% of that community shows up, and maybe that community even grows because we become more powerful and more easily able to reach new people to sort of join their ranks. But that's kind of the funny thing, is that conservatives work with a very concentrated national collection of groups, but they are highly competitive everywhere, whereas the liberals have a very broad national kind of voter profile appeal, but they only actually are able to win in concentrated areas, because in other ridings, the NDP or the Conservatives have sort of monopolies on certain groups that they can't access.
And that's where you get into a lot of a lot of issues that more fringe right parties get into. Say, I'll pick one example that's not talked about as much, like the Christian Heritage Party, is as Wyatt's saying, the right is dealing with more broad, more dispersed archetypes of voters that they're trying to deal with. But the corollary with that, and this is why some of these small parties like the PPC or the Christian Heritage Party or the Libertarian Party or whatever end up failing quite a lot, is any particular riding is not usually, unless it's deep rurals, that dominated by any particular subcategory of voter. You pick your favorite riding in, say, Nova Scotia, you're going to have some SoCons and you're going to have some libertarian types. You're going to have gun owners. You're going to have all dispersed groups of people. And if you want to win that riding, you have to win all of these people, all these different groups, which means fundamentally something like the Conservative Party has to be more broad-tented, because versus compared to like the Liberals or the NDP, which can be more focused. Like the NDP can win a riding if that riding is enough union people just by winning the union people. It can win Hamilton Centre as long as it's just does enough union stuff.
You get my point where I say that, and you're right, and that sounds almost contradictory to what I said. The Conservatives are a big tent, but it's a big tent of a lot of niche groups.
Yes, exactly.
Whereas the Liberals is a small tent of a really big faction of kind of middle class, upper middle class, white collar, like somewhat progressive, somewhat moderate people. It's very concentrated, easy to define category in a certain sense. It sounds weird, like I wasn't able to define it, but you get my point. Mm-hmm. It's just like you see someone shopping at Safeway, 50% shot they're a liberal voter. You're very easy to find them. Whereas the Conservatives, you have to be like, is that a pro-life voter? Is that a gun voter? Is that like, is that like a hawkish foreign policy voter? That's the kind of like people you're looking for. So like when you go to a conservative convention, it's far more divisive at times because the different factions interact and have friction with each other. Where like a liberal convention, sometimes there's like common policy issues that divide them, but it's not because they're factions. Mm-hmm. There's not really a union faction in the Liberal Party. There's union members, but it's usually people whose upper middle class type class identity tends to overcome their sort of work type or whatever.
Yeah, which is why, and we touched on this in previous episodes, that small parties like the PPC or the Christian Heritage Party, other ones, end up circling into purity testing because they don't want to try to cross appeal, because the cross appeal from, say, in the PPC's case, like the more libertarian right to more socially conservative people, you have to abandon some libertarian principles. To do that, you can't win them otherwise. And that's when you get, say, Maxime Bernier in his campaign in Portage-Lisgar, where he says he's going to bring a 24-week limit abortion federally, and it's like, that's actually nothing. That he's not actually saying anything. So, and all the pro-life people in Portage-Lisgar know he's not saying anything, because that is already the status quo across the country. Nowhere in Canada can you get a 24-week abortion.
Well, you can get one like 9th month in hospitals, but abortion clinics no.
Yeah, you can get some like quote unquote emergency ones. They're not actually emergencies, but anyways, in some hospitals. But usually they send you to the U.S. outpatient for that. It's very, very, very difficult to get one after 24 weeks in Canada. But a lot of pro-life voters know that. So when you say you're going to do that limit, it's like, okay, you're doing like 1% of abortions are being targeted by this.
Also, you're in a riding where default the Liberal MP is going to be pro-life and probably much more strongly pro-life than Maxime Bernier was in that by-election, and certainly more than he was over his entire career arc. And what you say what about Portage-Lisgar voters is that they are rural voters. Like there's obviously some city centers there, but you define it as a rural voter. So you actually kind of have to line up on them, not just on some policy issues, but on attitude issues. So there's a reason why there's very much a culture difference between a big city conservative MP and a rural MP, even if they're both social conservatives, they're both fiscal liberals or something like that, is that there's an attitude difference that, like, when Bernier shows up to Portage-Lisgar and he's still wearing his, strange menswear shirts where they're all like crazy tie-dye patterns and stuff like that, it's like you immediately entered a riding and you didn't get it. Like, why are you driving around a purple SUV with your face on it? Like, that actually is going to actually put people off in this area. You should be putting on jeans, a plaid shirt and going around shaking hands at farmers markets. And he's like campaigning like this is Beauce, which ironically he never actually campaigned in Beauce in 2019 or 21. He was in rural areas the entire time. So he's been a very much of a stylistic mismatch with his riding and in the places that he's been trying to run in. But I think this is actually a fantastic time to transition to another topic that I think we want to touch on from last time, which was the idea of the establishment appeal or the anti-establishment appeal, because that is very much something that Maxime Bernier has tried to play on as a PPC candidate, and as well as a lot of Green Party politicians who see themselves, or even sometimes NDP, as the alternative to the establishment conservatives and liberals. And I think it's because of online politics that being anti-establishment has become a really big kind of watchword. I mean, I'm anti-establishment, or is that person part of the establishment? And people don't define these things properly, and that kind of becomes a problem for people's understanding of how politics actually works. And this happens all the time in the U.S., and I'll probably use U.S. examples since I plugged Stephen Michael Davis's channel last video, and I think people should go check it out. But he does a really good breakdown. I want to do a bit of further discussion here of like, it's not actually a bad thing sometimes to be establishment. Not that I'm pro-establishment. You shouldn't be pro-establishment or anti-establishment. But so many people who are starting off in politics, whether it's in the nominations or it's in smaller party circuits, don't seem to understand that there are certain things that establishment politicians and parties actually do very well. And that's why people show up and vote for them every election, and then they suddenly abandon them all at once when they stop doing certain things, or they are doing certain things very well.
There's a really good U.S. example of this, especially now that he's retiring. Mitch
McConnell?
Mitch McConnell, there we go. I was about to forget his name. Somehow. So he gets a lot of ridicule and attack from the hard right in the U.S. They really don't like him. They find him really soft and squishy.
I wouldn't even exactly call them the hard right. It's more of just the populist right.
Sure, let's say the populist right.
Some of them are even sort of center-left on certain economic issues.
And they really don't like Mitch McConnell, but if you actually break down and look at what Mitch McConnell's done for the Republican Party, I don't think he should get single-hand credit for this, but he's a very large reason why the Republicans managed to get 6 justices in the Supreme Court. He himself is a very, very big reason why that happened. So he gets a huge amount of credit for why Roe v. Wade was overturned. And the reason why he can do something like that is you need to have the credibility and the institutional inertia on your side to have that kind of power. But then you look at, say, the Republican Congress right now, where they just keep throwing their what is the word for it? The speakers out of the window because the speaker disagrees with the populist right in 1% of things, and it's like, oh no, get rid of them. And then you just get circular firing squads that no one can hold up to the purity of these populist right types.
Well, people have to see, the thing is in U.S. politics too, voting records really matter, way more actually than in Canada, because in Canadian politics, one can say that, well, it was a whipped vote, I had to do it or I would have been kicked out or something like that. Where in U.S. politics, you, as the leader of the Senate or the leader of the House, you have to do a lot of work to be able to bridge the gap between people whose voting records on a certain issue could get them thrown out of their Connecticut House representative riding. Whereas down in Arizona, if you don't vote that way, you're going to be thrown out. And so then you have to have a leader who's able to market the bill, twist the bill a little bit, and so that it doesn't hurt anyone, or at least benefits everyone, or it doesn't hurt people too much, depending on where they are in the country. So that's where it's I've never understood hatred for senators like Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham is a extremely good senator. And people are like, but he's establishment. He's some neocon, whatever. It's he's done probably far more. He probably got Kavanaugh through that Senate hearing. His actual stance in that Senate hearing on Justice Brett Kavanaugh probably got him approved as the next Supreme Court senator, because he, even though he's actually probably one of the most pro-life senators in the country, tends to put on a more moderate kind of face on how he talks about issues. So when he swiveled in favor of Brett Kavanaugh, that probably was what turned a lot of public opinion against the sort of smear campaign that was going on against him to try and get him cut from the SCOTUS appointment.
Lindsey Graham is also a good example, because in 22, for those who remember watching that election in more detail, the Lindsey Graham announced a proposal in mid-October that the GOP should bring in or look at bringing a 15-week ban on abortion federally. And a lot of populist right types and a lot of people were saying, he's doing this to sabotage Republicans. They're about to win the Congress by a huge margin. They're trying to destroy it. And it's well, we know now, afterwards, that the Republicans only barely won the House. And I would contend, I made a video about this last year, one of the big reasons why Republicans really almost failed to win the House in 22 and have done really bad in several key elections since then, since Roe, is not because of Roe. Anyone who says, we banned abortion so we're getting destroyed now, it's no. That's just entirely cope. The reason the Republicans do really bad on a lot of these things is they won't pick a stance. They don't tell voters what they actually want. They're just we'll leave it up to the states. And it's but what does that mean? People want to know what this means, what your stance is. And Lindsey Graham proposing to say, we're going to do 15 weeks. That's a concrete stance. You can tell people and they can understand what that means.
Well, it was the Andrew Scheer problem in 2019. He actually got the media off his back as soon as he said, I am fundamentally pro-life, and I will vote in a pro-life direction, and it will be free votes in my caucus for people who want to make their own decision on these issues. Immediately, they couldn't attack him anymore because, you can't really push that any further than that answer gave you. That answer pretty much ended the entire discussion. And so it stopped the bleeding he had, because when in the previous months, when he wouldn't tell people what his stance was, then it gave the media the story that they could keep rerunning. What's he hiding? What's his radical agenda on this? When he just says, I'm 100% pro-life, I'll vote that way, and my caucus can vote how they want, it's what's a media personality going to say? Well, you're not going to force people to vote a certain way, because that seems like a horrible, stupid thing to say in response. What, you're not going to whip votes on issues? You're going to allow people to follow their conscience? It's really hard to push up against conscience.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things where, as you were saying, being reflexively anti-establishment doesn't work, because if you label someone such as Lindsey Graham or other people.
Dan Crenshaw's another good one. He literally, in theory, the populist right should love him. He's actually pretty much in line with them on everything except maybe foreign policy, because some people are weird on foreign policy and believe, isolationism is the answer to everything, just as it was before World War II. But like, he on paper is a great candidate, but he's like, no, he sometimes agrees with Mitch McConnell. And so, well, maybe they're doing something right that you haven't considered yet, that they're very good at actually reaching middle-class people who don't want politics to be a gong show. They're like, the closest someone's ever actually gotten to beating Mitch McConnell in a primary was 2014, and he won with 65% of the vote. That was the closest a Senate Republican primary had ever been. There's a reason that and the thing is that in Kentucky, it's a state where Democrats can win Senate races. And so his first one was close, and then his second one was less close, and his third one was less close, because over time, people in his local area started trusting him. And also there's a mentality in the US and even in Canada that everyone else's MP is terrible except for my guy locally. People like to assume their local guy is very good, and everyone else's is bad. It's like, well, maybe actually everyone's MP or state rep or senator is probably right on some things and probably bad on some things, except for the exceptions who are horrible. And there's a reason why Mitch McConnell is very popular. It's not because he pays people off. It's not because he does any of this stuff. They win their Senate, not primaries, election after election, not because anyone's rigging it. There's tons of money in American politics. And there's a lot of people who would put up a bunch of money to get rid of Mitch McConnell. But the money never ends up really materializing. It's not because anyone was doing something in the background. It didn't materialize because they can see on the ground, when you talk to retirees, when you talk to people who are 40 years old, 3 kids, and you ask them, well, do you hate Mitch McConnell? Didn't you see what he did on this vote? Blah, blah, blah. Isn't he such a horrible establishment neocon? And that person's like, what are you talking about? I think he's fine. And it's like, you have to overcome people thinking that the guy's fine because they can't actually see anything wrong with his voting record. He's doing his job and he's doing it well. And it's like, you have to offer more than simply not being like that guy. I'm anti-establishment. I'm against everything he does. Well, maybe 60% of what he does is actually quite good and only 40% of it's bad. You have to target him on specific issues, or you are always going to just seem like a naysayer. That's why Bernier, because he doesn't stick to certain issues like we've said in the past, comes off like a naysayer, because he just opposes everything the Conservatives say, even if it's 80% in line with what he's saying, because they're not good enough. And now it doesn't just seem like the petty party of Canada.
To quote a Twitter user by the name Edmunds Smirk, there is an important thing you need to have in his verbiage is Swiftian normality. And that's one of the big issues a lot of these anti-establishment movements and people have, is if you're constantly pushing against everything in the status quo is bad, everything is terrible, all of the people in charge are the worst, well, as we kind of touched on in the last episode too, it's like you
at that point there's nothing left to do but go to the rope store and the rickety stool store.
Yeah, sort of. Like you're asking everyone to be at an intensity level of 8, 9, 10, and no one's ever really at that intensity level outside of a severe crisis. People want
go
things
to a town hall meeting. Nobody likes the guy who's standing at the back, like, yelling about how, like, there's globalists everywhere and you're not talking about it, and don't you know about the and it's like, you might even be right about some things, but nobody wants to, like, feel like they agree with the guy who's wearing, like, 2 layers of plaid jackets and chewing on tobacco all the time. There's a certain aesthetic that does not attract most people, and people are very aesthetic voters. People do vote on policy, but they also vote on aesthetics, and they also vote on vibes. People vote for things for a lot of reasons, and many of them feel very irrational, and they seem very much like shallow, but it is quite deep and complex when you actually study it, even if the person can't articulate why they do what they do.
So a good anecdotal example is, so I was canvassing the other day, and this is kind of a negative example, but it's kind of still interesting. So I came across 2 separate people at the door who sat and talked to me for a while. One guy was going on about every single fringe righty anti-establishment theory you can think of, like WEF, chemtrails, the vaccine stuff, like every possible conspiracy you could think of. He was talking to me about them. And the whole and I've heard all these arguments. I've seen all of them. Some are not entirely out there. Some of them are just wild and bats, like the idea that people random public jet or random commercial jets are changing the weather is just bats. But when you're sitting there talking to that guy, and in this case I'm the canvasser, I'm just really off put. This is super awkward. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to get out of this conversation because I don't want to just walk away from this guy. And it's really off-putting. And then the next guy, and both these guys are very similar in the sense that they don't like any of the political parties right now. They aren't happy. They're very discontent with the status quo. This next guy is giving me very basic, normal reasons to be discontent. He doesn't like how all the parties are giving too much support and too much enabling people and stuff like that. We have too much credit and stuff like that. And he gives very articulate, very clear, normal reasons why he doesn't like how the stress test is too low for mortgages, for example. And the experience at the door between these two people is very different. And then you flip this. So it's not I'm canvassing, they're canvassing me. And then you can really see in that circumstance how that's going to really come across. If someone's canvassing you and is talking to you about all sorts of conspiracy theory stuff, whether it's valid or not, it's going to be really off-putting. You make me feel really awkward. Where someone's
there's actually something very fundamentally very emotional about what they're saying. And it's like if someone starts crying in front of you, you're not going to be like, "Oh, they're crying," and like, "Oh, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Oh, that doesn't look fun." Like you're going to feel kind of odd because it doesn't. You can't connect with this person in this moment, and that's what a lot of conspiratorial stuff is. It's fundamentally very emotional, which is why the best way of figuring out the biggest piece of evidence or factor that will influence if someone believes in one conspiracy is that they believe in another. It's not whether or not the evidence is good. It's often, is it emotionally satisfying like this other one I have? And the funny thing is that those same people, a little bit of a detour, some of these people will be actually right on certain things, but then through pushing all this other stuff, people don't want to listen to you anymore. This is actually why the BC Conservatives got rid of two of their candidates early onto them being selected, because they were like COVID era doctors and nurses, and they were going way too far down the rabbit hole of actually I can prove that 100,000 people in this country are now vaccine injured, or in this province are vaccine injured, and blah blah blah. It's like I'm gonna say, just from my own personal opinion, I don't think he's correct in any way. Like, these people are correct. At the same time, even if you're correct and you can't prove it, what's the point? You're making people like very uncomfortable over something that you can't even actually solve for them. You're basically it's basically a grievance, and you don't want to be the grievance party. And the other guy with the it's easy to connect with the guy talking about mortgages and stress tests, because if you're a politician, you can actually solve that.
Yeah. And just to once again quote Mr. Edmunds Smirk, he made a really good tweet. I wish I could bring it up. I don't have it queued up here, where he said that he was talking to right-wingers in particular, but it generalizes that if you're going to say something, even if it's true, even if you know for a fact it's true, you have to think, is this a productive thing to say? Is this going to advance my political interests? Because if you say something that might be objectively true for the sake of saying something that is true, that is going to hurt your interests, that's actually just a vice. Saying a truth that harms you is a vice behavior.
And this is not a stance. Well, like, and I would say that you're not saying don't be principled, don't have principles. It's that at a door, if somebody doesn't want to talk about religion, don't talk about religion. Exactly. I'm not going to run people through all the Baptist distinctives to see if they're cool enough to vote for me. That's stupid. That's going to make. And here's actually a great example I actually had yesterday while I was door knocking with a volunteer. We had this one guy, like, obviously not naming anybody and keeping it vague, but he had gotten an email from one of the other candidates. This guy actually liked Ron Liepert. He liked Ron Liepert, frankly, because he wasn't Rob Anders, who was the MP before. I actually don't mind Rob Anders. I think he's a good guy, and I'm friendly with him. I actually don't like Ron Liepert, as people have probably been able to tell from early in this episode. Very, very red, not very principled, I find, or at least his principles are very much to the left. But this guy probably likes Ron because it felt like normality after Rob Anders, who Rob Anders could be a little bit more eccentric and a little bit more extremely outspoken on issues. And so he liked Liepert on a from a stylistic point of view. And now the guy that he was commenting on that he got an email from is effectively Liepert's right-hand man that's running to basically just be a continuation of Liepert. And what's funny is this guy quite literally just said, I got this email from him, and he says, not to be rude, it was just flatulence. It was just nonsense. It was his resume he sent me as if I was supposed to clap for him or something like that. And it's like, the funny thing is he's been presented with pretty much the exact same carbon copy candidate. Liepert he likes. Basically Liepert's friend who's running, he doesn't like, and he's a very establishment kind of like what you'd consider for the riding in terms of who's exactly like Liepert. And it's just that in the context that this guy had approached him, that when you're a new candidate and you're supposed to feel new and he feels old, that now somebody offering the exact same thing that he apparently liked before is now no longer in vogue. Because everything is very context based. This guy basically put out an email that Ron Liepert could have put out, but he didn't like it because it wasn't Ron Liepert putting it out.
That's a really big issue. You see a lot of times in candidates or policies. It's, oh, this worked in the past, therefore it should work again. That's not necessarily true, because things advance, new ideas come through the population, people are different. And the other really big thing, and this is like the core of my last point, too, which I'll just clarify in case it was not very clear. It's not that you shouldn't have principles. It's not that you shouldn't tell the truth. It's that when you go to tell someone something that's true or what you believe in, you have to make sure you phrase it in a productive way. Because if you say it in the wrong way, even if you are true and you are correct, you've hurt your cause. Like, in the example of Wyatt just gave,
the PPC kind of burned the immigration issue for a couple of years there, and now is the Conservative Party and Pierre Poilievre figuring out the ways of maneuvering it in order to be able to advocate to the middle class voter. Yes, like immigration does need to be cut.
Yeah, I've actually seen a couple of, even now, and these are really self-destructive versions of this argument, where there's people saying that I saw a Twitter post, and someone is saying we should deport everyone who's came here since 1970. And it's like, why are you even saying that? That's just obviously unreasonable. Almost no one is going to think that's reasonable. Someone's been here for 50 years, we should deport them when they have not committed a crime and they came here normally? That's ridiculous. But then people like that will poison the well of the conversation for people who actually have a reasonable, articulate, rational argument. And that's kind of what Edmunds Smirk's getting at with his comment, is that, yeah, maybe immigration is the problem, but you have to phrase your opposition to immigration in a way that is rational, reasonable, and attainable. Saying you want to deport everyone is not rational, reasonable, or attainable.
I did this I've done this with people at the doors who literally voted NDP provincially, and they had been federal Liberal voters. They signed up for memberships for me in Signal Hill, and it's because I think I was the first person to actually explain parental rights to them in the language of the center left. I'm still taking as hardcore of a parental rights position as I have. I only think should describe it as hardcore principled position, but I described it using the words, using the language of tolerance and whatnot, and So I used actually like the language of tolerance in terms of, well, it's actually kind of a nasty thing to be pushing gender theory on kids when they feel vulnerable, when they feel isolated because, they're growing up, everything feels awkward and whatnot. And now a teacher's now pushing extremely complex ideological ideas on them. And now they have to make quick decisions, and they have to make decisions with their identity out of nowhere. And I even said, back when we were growing up, we never got this forced on us. And middle school is already bad enough. And now these kids are having strange suggestions brought up to them in class, stuff that you just don't want in your head right now. Like, you don't want a whole class on taxes when you're 15 years old. It's going to stress you out. That's probably why they don't teach things like fundamental finances in high school, because it probably stresses a lot of kids out who don't really even know how to get a summer job yet, and knowing exactly what the tax codes are. And that actually got the person to come around and say, like, yeah, I guess I probably wouldn't have wanted to have all this stuff weighing on my mind at that time in my life.
And that actually goes into a very interesting thing about uh, psychology and persuasion of people. So there's this, I can't think of the proper terminology here, but generally speaking, if you present someone with an idea, they will automatically reject it if it's too far outside of their understanding. And when you present the idea, it's the language and phrasing you use to present it. So I'll give an example of this because it'll make it more clear. If were to go to, I don't know, conservative and say, oh, we need to abolish single family homes because there's not enough homes, 100% of conservatives are going to say, screw off and leave. Because that is so far outside of the wheelhouse of what is acceptable to a conservative. They're not going to, they'll never engage with you. And that's why most internet arguments are arguments and not debates, because it's just people yelling at each other in language and phrasing that is innately unacceptable to the other person. They can never accept the phrasing of these arguments. Whereas in that particular case, what you actually want to be, the person was actually trying to say to the conservative, is we need to change zoning laws. And whether that's actually good or idea or not is another whole other topic. But saying, oh, we need to change zoning laws to build more buildings is a very different thing than saying we need to abolish single family homes. But someone might easily, you see left wingers use both arguments. And one is terrible and one might work. And it obviously works in reverse in any possible situation. You have to make sure you're tailoring your argument to the person you are talking to. And you have to make sure you're tailoring it in a way that is not unacceptable to them, which is as Wyatt was doing with his phrasing it in like progressive language.
And this is what goes back to there's nothing wrong with steaming establishment, because in most people's minds, establishment is mainstream, it's normal, that's what is acceptable. And so you don't have to change your policy positions whatsoever, other than if you're one of those fools saying we should deport everyone who came here before 1970. But you can run on literally anything as long as you can convince somebody, and not in like with guile or anything, just through the idea that you truly believe in this, that this is what we should all, this is the mainstream agenda that we should all be aligned with. That when I talk about immigration at the doors, because my fundamental position is that we have to lower it significantly so that not only do we just stabilize housing prices, because it's way too expensive now that the housing prices actually start reversing and going down for a little bit. But I always talk about that we all know it's way too much. I always talk to new immigrants about reducing immigration. They're on board because none of them fundamentally are offended by the idea that math doesn't work out in favor of 500,000 permanent residents per year plus another 500,000 temporary foreign workers and students. No, as long as you can actually explain it without being someone who comes across like they eat human flesh and start going on about, like they're like, we can't have all these people, they're from these different countries. It's like, what are you talking about? It's just it's such a stupid way of putting it. And this is what goes to the way the PPC tends to market themselves as, where like, not market themselves, but the way that they marketing themselves is always the idea that they have to wake people up, and it lends itself to a very emotional way of marketing, that they have to wake up your soul or something like that to open their eyes and see that the PPC was actually right about everything. And that's not appealing to people for multiple reasons. Not only just for the fact that it's a very arrogant way of thinking that people actually change their opinions about things, is that the spark happens in their brain and then they just believe everything that you say. It's actually almost very religious, the way that they're talking about their party.
It's also kind of funny too, because even in that terminology, it doesn't really make much sense. Like if you're sleeping and someone comes up and shakes you awake to wake you up very violently and vigorously, your first reaction is not going to be, I'm going to support you. That's going to be probably slapping him in the face because that was very unpleasant, and then go back to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Like, kind of a silly example, or free to phrase it, but the point is, like, you don't wake someone up. Because first off, the implication that someone is sleeping was kind of belittling to begin with, and not a good way to approach an argument to begin with. But the main thing is they probably are aware of most of this stuff, and if they're not, and you come at them in a rational, civil, normal manner, and you actually have a valid point, they'll probably agree with you anyways. People are usually pretty good about that stuff. You go to someone and it's like, oh yeah, we have this problem. The mortgage stress test is too low, and it's making it so people can afford houses they can't afford, and it's causing housing prices. Oh yeah, I can see where you're coming from with that. Yeah, that makes sense.
The only people I find that are unreasonable at the doors, it's never that we're halfway into a policy discussion and then they start being super unreasonable, like, no, 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 I don't believe that, and you're lying. It's always somebody, the unreasonable people make themselves known within 5 seconds of the door opening. Hey, I'm Wyatt Claypool. I'm running for the Conservative Party nomination, Calgary Signal Hill. They're like, no, 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 I vote Liberal. I hope you guys never win. And it's something like that. Like, I had someone like that the other day. Oh, I hope you lose something, something. And yet, like, if you're actually in a long discussion, the person naturally doesn't want to get into a fight. If we've been talking for 2 minutes already, it's generally, they might not agree. That I've had people not agree, but it's never been this unreasonable puzzle that can't be put together. Oftentimes, I've even had people disagree with me in the first third of the conversation. By the second third, we're agreeing on some things, and by the last third, they're actually starting to agree on me with the thing that we originally disagreed on. It's being able to figure out what are their concerns, what do they care about, and being able to connect those things with your policy, even if on your policy that you originally pitched they weren't on board, but you can say, okay, but on this thing, you agree with this principle, and they're like, yes, well, that's exactly what I'm trying to apply to this, and they're like, well, fair enough, I can kind of see it that way. People are so much more reasonable than you would ever believe if you go door knocking, and also some people are far more unreasonable than you would have ever expected.
And that actually goes back and links both of our previous main conversation archetypes together. The anti establishment types and the purity testing are sort of one and the same because the exact process you described there is what the quote unquote establishment does is you take a bunch of disparate people who might not agree on everything, but you find what they actually agree on, and then you can build a functional working political coalition to do something. But the anti-establishment people yield more into a purity testing thing. It's like, oh, you don't agree with me on this? That's a deal breaker. I will never work with you, and then they leave. But and say my example, locally, live in Halifax West. If I took that kind of purity testing stance and I wanted everyone to be like me, I would never have any hope of anyone winning the riding that even remotely agrees with me on anything. The Liberals will win my riding by default. And if I don't want that, the people I work with, we have to find people who agree on most things or on just enough things. Because we can't find everyone who agrees with everything. They just don't exist. Not enough numbers in this riding. Maybe in some very deep rural ridings, or very deep urban ridings, if you're a left winger, you could find enough people who are broadly the same demeanor that it would work. But then you're locking a shockingly few people. And how do you make political change with just the odd riding here or there?
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with having to create a coalition. I think now, because of like the NDP coalition with the Liberals, there's a negative association with having to form coalitions in terms of anything that it actually is your purity. It's almost Gnosticism, that it's your ideological purity that is where you get your power from. And I will tell these people, actually, no. If anything, also some of these people, I would say, they fundamentally are not even as pure as they think. And that's the thing with populism, is that it's oftentimes people are embracing policies that only became in vogue in this kind of niche community that they're in recently, and that they actually don't, and that they actually haven't been as principled as they would like to think. Like, they actually have this is the thing with the PPC's crowd, is they actually have a fundamentally left-wing view of the world on several issue fronts. They tend to actually be very much in line with like an NDP, Green Party's politicians' view on like the elites and corporations and whatnot. Like, the PPC is very anti-corporate in what becomes an almost anti-capitalistic manner.
What I find actually kind of interesting about the PPC in general is I find it combines two really interesting demeanors together that doesn't. Prior to the PPC existing, I could not I would not have expected these two could ever merge. So generally speaking, there's like 5 different types of community. So you have your deep rural areas, which are like your small hamlets and your small villages, stuff like that, right? Then you have your small towns, like maybe like 5, 10, 15,000 kind of stuff. Then you have like your more suburban communities. Then you have your, what I call the outer core, which is like in Halifax terminology might be like Clayton Park West or other inner suburbs that now have some apartment buildings going in, quite dense suburbs, but it's more suburby. Then you have your downtowns, which are like proper, like pretty much everyone lives in apartment buildings and stuff like that, right? Usually, voters in each of these 5 different areas are, the demeanor that they have is very different.
And even there's usually communities in those communities, but like the
Yeah,
suburban voter, which I'm mostly talking to these days, you do get people who are almost like what you would describe as nervously middle class, and it's almost with their middle class outlook. They might be very conservative people, but they tend to like talk about themselves and talk about their beliefs in very middle of the road, calm kind of ways. They're not subject to like wild passions, I guess, when it comes to political rhetoric.
yeah. So the big thing with these 5 arc communities, obviously, there's subversions in this and variation with the like jobs and workforce and stuff like that. But overall, these 5 communities are very similar, self-similar among themselves. And what we're kind of seeing with the PPC is it's kind of the combination of, I would call like the outer core voter, but also like the deep rural voter at the same time. Because the deep rural voter is quite libertarian in a lot of ways, whereas the outer core voter is usually the more populist or the more on the conservative side of the spectrum, more willing to use government to do things because they live in a city and people who live in cities tend to be more pro-government doing things. But anyways, so you get this kind of weird combination of the PPC where you have a bunch of people who want the government to do things. What they want the government to do is to delete itself, which is just bizarre.
Well, this is a strange way of putting it, but there's actually a lot of connections between libertarians, like real libertarians, not just I'm kind of libertarian on these few issues. Real libertarians and socialists are actually very similar in the sense that the idea is that they're very utopian and they believe that you should give power to them so that they can remake the system because then everything will be suddenly fair if everything 100% is made in their way. So they tend to be very dissatisfied voters, which is why it's very hard to keep a libertarian party together because if they don't get what they want, it tends to be like, well, what's the point of even trying? Same thing with socialist parties, like outright socialist parties. That nothing's ever good enough, so it just becomes a party of grievance.
It's very telling that there's 2 different communist parties in Canada.
Yeah, well, one's more of a cult at this point, but yes.
Sure, but it's a very telling. I mean, in Slovakia right now, I mean, these aren't really communist parties; they're kind of socialist. There's 2 different. There's Shmer, and there's a related party that just broke off of Shmer over a very niche thing, which was Ukraine policy. Completely broke and made a separate party that has like decent traction. It's like what? Or in Germany, there's the 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 left in English, and then you have one particular MP or whatever the Germans call their legislators broke off and made the BSW, the Sarah Betchwin Party or whatever you pronounce her name. And that happens so often among ideologically left-wing areas where they just fracture into like a million splinter parties over very bizarre grievances. But to more going outside of funny little concrete examples like that, I do agree there's a spirit that libertarians and socialists have together, which is this utopian idea that they can make society better. And in a lot of ways, a lot of libertarians will hate me for saying this, but libertarianism in a lot of ways is sort of a left-wing ideology in that, because in my formulation of politics, if you've ever watched my Understanding Politics series, is one of the core defining features of something being left-wing is its utopianism. And one of the defining features of something being right-wing or conservative is its pragmatism. And libertarianism is utopian.
I would say that also in order to gain that utopia, libertarians would necessarily have to become authoritarians in the sense that I see libertarians all the time complain that local communities, like small counties, have like dry laws, or that this local community has voted so that there's no cannabis stores in their area in both Canada and the U.S. And it's like they would necessarily have to show up to that area of like Amish people and force Amish people to become the sort of morally like subjectivist type urban area that this libertarian hipster lives in. And so it really is just that they have a vision of the world in which nobody gets in their way specifically, but they're totally actually in favor of getting into other people's ways in social and economic types of certain ways. I mean, like they are fine in cramming down on other people. They just have the "I'm not touching you" kind of mentality of social behavior.
Which actually kind of I think it was Michael Knowles who said this, that at this point in political discourse in 20, I think he said this in like 2023, but at this point in time, the word authoritarian literally means nothing because it's really just used as a slur against somebody, because everyone, at the end of the day, is authoritarian for the things they want and libertarian for the things against the things they don't want, if that makes sense.
This is why I advocate for the philosophy of reasonableness, that you will not like everything that's going on, and you will not you will not love or hate everything that's going on in any particular area. It's just make it somewhat better, but going for 100% of what you want is probably going to lead to more problems than it's going to solve.
And I would just say too, just fundamentally, if you consider yourself right wing or conservative, you can't internally accept that you can actually get 100% of anything solved. Because to assume you can fix any problem to 100% solved, that'll never be a problem again, it's completely fixed, is utopian. And that's just not pragmatic. It's not pragmatic to assume you can fix anything because the world is too complicated. There's too many moving parts. Can you really tell me right now that you can make 41 million Canadians all be perfectly rational, happy, normal people who don't do anything crazy and don't hurt anyone else on purpose for fun? No. Like, at the very basis, right? We can't fix murder. Why can we fix anything fully? We can minimize it. Don't get me wrong. We can never fix it. That makes sense.
Localism is very nice because at very least we're lowering the amount of people that you have to please in a specific area.
Yes, I'm very pro decentralization in that regard because there's no practical way to run a big society as unitarian state. That's kind of abstract, but it's easier to make people happy and okay if the decision making is done at the lowest level that they can be done at. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, but I think this is a good transition point to now go on to a kind of third topic we wanted to talk about, which was another kind of strange, small, well, not strange, but I mean, kind of maybe not, people weren't expecting us to talk about this, but I think we both wanted to talk about micro scandals and some of the recent micro scandals in Canadian politics and why, in a certain sense, they just don't matter at all.
Yep. So the most recent one, and I hate even saying that this happened, but people are talking about it, so we're going to talk about it too. So Alex Jones endorsed Poilievre.
Dum dum dum.
And now people, usually on Twitter, but some pundits and media types, there might even be a couple articles in the news media about this now, are being like, Poilievre must rebuke this endorsement and blah, 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 because Alex Jones is a terrible person, he's verboten, and he's awful. And the fact that this happened is going to hurt Poilievre, he's going to lose his polling lead, and it's like, what? It blows my mind that there's people in journalism who do this for a living who think that the average person even knows this happened.
Yeah. And that's the problem with online politics is people assume that everybody sees stuff that happens online. Most people don't use social media in a day at all, other than for like frivolous reasons, not like whatever reason you're using it for is dumb. I just mean just looking at photos of their friend's cat or whatever. That's kind of the way people use social media. So when if Justin Trudeau and his team, as terrible as their comms team is, they're never seriously going to run out to a presser event and start talking about, did you see that Alex Jones endorsed Pierre Poilievre? And it's like, because nobody cares. And even then, people will be like, okay, so what? So what? Yes, because between Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre, he prefers Pierre Poilievre. Like, I would mention to these people that we actually had Hamas, thank Canada, for voting against Israel at the UN General Assembly. So, what's your point here? Like, yes, crazy populist guy Alex Jones endorses Pierre Poilievre. Also, baby murdering rapists just endorsed Justin Trudeau. And even then, it would be stupid to run on Hamas, like, thanking the Canadian government, because it's too niche. It's too hard to explain all the intricacies of why that matters.
And in a lot of ways, a lot of voters aren't, even if you explain it to them and you make it make sense and you get all the details and intricacies, which are quite hard. At the end of the day, a lot of people are going to look at them and be like, okay, but like, what? Why should we be mad at him for something that someone else did? Like, in the case of Alex Jones, like, Poilievre didn't publicly ask Alex Jones to do anything. It just happened. What? No rational person is going to be mad at someone for someone else doing something unprovoked. And you kind of see this with a lot of other things too. Like, that's obviously the most recent one, but there's smaller little scandals that pop up, or kind of like an anti-scandal in a way, kind of more like the messaging side, but related ideas. Whereas there's a big stink. Stink is the wrong word. There's a big like sigh of like hope on a lot of left-wing circles on the internet the other day, because Trudeau announced that he wanted to restrict some level of temporary immigration. I don't recall the exact numbers, but he wanted to cut down like student visas and TFWs. And the Trudeau government's been announcing all sorts of deals with cities and provinces to change zoning laws. People are like, Trudeau owns the housing issue now, and Poilievre is going to get destroyed, and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, what?
Housing prices have to fundamentally start going down for people to think the federal government, who's been in power for 9 years, is doing a bang up job. Like, it's going to take more than like an announcement. That's where I think a lot of people who are in politics too long think press events matter, and they mostly don't. It's great fodder for me to comment on in videos, but for the most part, people don't watch politics in that great. Less than 1% of people probably in Canada see any of these press events. And I'm talking about not just about live, they saw it. I mean, they've seen less than 1% of Canadians, maybe if it's like a really big one that goes on all the mainstream channels. But like most press events, maybe 1% of people even saw a clip of it that somebody talked about on a YouTube channel. Most people don't care. And even with the temporary foreign worker and student restrictions they're putting in place, they only did that because those numbers were already falling. So they put a cap in place after it had already fallen below the cap level.
But you also kind of see this too in like a lot of right wingers or conservative voters right now who are like scared in all circumstances. They're petrified that whenever something slightly happens, that probably is going to lose his entire lead. But it's usually, in my experience, people getting petrified over really tiny things that won't matter. This was a little old news now, but last month, or was it in February? I don't know. Doesn't really matter. The Senate Bill S210, I believe, was sent to the House for first reading. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Wyatt, but I'm pretty sure that's what happened. So it became a big topic in the media, reasonably so, because journalists were asking, okay, what are the parties going to do? How do they support this bill? Because it's very rare that Senate bills happen, period. And since it was a Senate bill, no party had actually stuck much to it yet. And Poilievre's case was he was going to vote for S210. And the meat of the potatoes is S210 wants to put a standard on adult content on the internet that's going to require active, real age verification. Now, it's not specified yet what the age verification would be. That is part of the regulation that happens after the bill is passed, if it passes. But that is the meat and potatoes of the bill. There's going to be real voter verification, or age verification on adult content consumption, and there's penalties for websites that don't comply. And a lot of people are like, oh no, this is going to destroy Polyev. Oh no, this is terrible.
ID.
Sorry,
Apparently everything's digital ID now. I think since that issue became like a big thing 2 years ago, I think people have had a hard time defining what digital ID is.
Mm-hmm. And what I find funny about things like this is like, I have a heuristic. It's not perfect, but it's a heuristic. If no one mentions something to you in real life, no regular person does it. It could be your friend, could be your parents, could be your siblings, could be your kids if you have kids. If no one mentions it to you at all, it almost certainly never mattered. Because that is a very good proxy for if this information even disseminated, period.
Well, people act like people on the internet have the same incentives as people in real life to care about issues. And it's like, well, no. Especially when X is monetized now, there's a lot of reasons to make a big deal out of literally nothing in order to get some, new followers or literally money from Elon Musk. And so, yeah, like I've never had anyone bring up S22 to me. I literally had to search it while you were explaining it to see what I could find out about it. Like, it's one of those things where I believe Polyev pulled back on it. I don't even think he would have really had to pull back on what he thought about that bill, because what he actually cares very much. It's just that the people online tend to be the noisiest people, and also people online tend to be heavily disproportionately in the categories of very, not radical, but on kind of like the fringes of politics, that they're the 5% of people on the furthest left and furthest right who tend to make up a good 30% of the online discourse.
Yeah. And as you were saying, there's very big incentives online, even ignoring the money side of it, on like Twitter or something, to really make a big fuss about these things, because you get clout and you get prestige, you get internet famous, and people like that. It feeds into people's pride and their ego, and they're like, I feel really good about myself. I had 1,000 people like this tweet or whatever, which has not happened to me, but one day it might. And people like that. People will do it just for that. And then you get these kind of like weird microcosms, such as on Twitter and Canadian politics, where every single small thing gets like blown out of proportion because people are sniping back and forth at each other. But it's always people on the extreme end, not necessarily like the politically extreme, but like the extremely hyper involved people.
Here's my favorite micro scandal, and it does involve the PPC again, but it's whenever a politician goes to any cultural event that's not like Canada Today, and this becomes like a big thing where like, oh, Pierre Polyev is pandering to the Hindu community or to this community or that community or the Nepalese community. What is he? He's just playing dress up like Justin Trudeau. It's like, guys, this is the most normal political thing ever, and you could not like it, but acting like this is like the smoking gun that Pierre Polyev, Jagmeet Singh, and Justin Trudeau all went to a Lunar New Year event last year with Ken Sims in Vancouver is not really the gotcha you think it is, and nobody actually cares.
And the funny thing I'll say about that too is, I feel like a lot of these people make a big deal about something like that don't put themselves in the same shoes. It's like, yeah, sure, it's some niche, usually immigrant community, and obviously this person commenting is probably not a niche immigrant community, but just with my own perspective, like Easter was just last week, or was it the week before? I don't know. I'm terrible at dates. Doesn't matter. If, let's say, Polyev came to my church for the Easter Vigil and participated in it, even if he's not a Catholic, I'm gonna like the guy a bit more for doing that. You know what I mean? Like, he's participating in my stuff. That's kind of cool.
My church would be a bit different. I think people would almost be a little bit annoyed if it was obvious the person was there for a photo op.
Well,
but overall, like the average place you walk in, although there'd be some people like, not like, as long as people don't know you're there for only shallow reasons, I guess they will like it.
That's what I'll put the caveat. Yeah, as long as it's not overtly shallow, like you're doing your best part to like participate properly and normally. Like, people like that. Like, oh, it's nice when people are like
And like when someone invites you in potentially good faith that, hey, do you want to come to our Diwali event? And like, what are you gonna be like? No, I'm not participating in your stupid litmus test. I'm too hardcore for that. Like, or are you gonna say, oh, I'll swing by because I don't want to seem like a Grinch about it. Like you're gonna maybe even, you don't have to participate. Like, yeah, maybe people shouldn't wear headwear or like wear like little sort of like little like whatever it is do-rags on their head when they go to Sikh events because it's not part of the religion. Like that's my thing, is that I would probably not participate as much as other people do because I'd just be like, I don't believe in the religion. I feel like it's almost insulting to you for me to pretend. But that's like a personal thing. But you're like, yeah, fundamentally, who cares? And the funniest thing actually about the Alex Jones situation, to get back to that, is all the PPC people now extremely mad Alex Jones didn't come and endorse Maxime Bernier, as if this was the secret sauce that was going to get the PPC like lifted to new heights. Because everyone apparently watches InfoWars in their minds, even though when you actually go onto InfoWars' Rumble and YouTube channels and all the other places, it's like 40,000 views, 10,000 views. It's honestly a niche program, even by the United States standards.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just say with that too, like, I'm not saying endorsements don't matter, but people really blow out what endorsements mean because they completely don't understand what an endorsement is.
Endorsements help with extremely specific communities.
What an endorsement is it someone saying to their followers, you can vote for this guy. It says nothing about anyone else. If, for example, Bernie Sanders endorsed Singh, I believe, in 2021. That literally doesn't matter because the only people who like Bernie Sanders in Canada enough for his endorsement to matter are almost certainly already NDP. So that endorsement means nothing. The endorsement of Alex Jones to Poilievre almost certainly means nothing because there's probably a rounding error, like within rounding, 0 people in Canada who really care about Alex Jones' like actual opinions. Yeah, that's what makes sense.
And you can even see, in a certain sense, like with the PPC people now mad at Alex Jones and saying, oh, he just doesn't know that Poilievre's actually a fraud. It's like, it demonstrates that, yeah, the endorsement doesn't matter because the people who even like Alex Jones and they're voting PPC, they will then reject Alex Jones and then retroactively come up with theories about how he's actually very establishment for having done this. Like, endorsements matter to the people who are already going to do the thing that you were wanting them to do, and if they endorse somebody else, they will then like say, well, sometimes they're wrong, and then they'll keep voting the way they're voting.
The main time in my experience when endorsements actually like genuinely matter is if you're talking about a relatively unknown candidate. Let's say there's a hypothetical leadership race because I don't know, Poilievre died tragically, and there's a new leadership race in the Conservative Party. And you just had 6 random people that have never run before. They're just random conservatives in the country. Endorsements then will matter because people don't know who these people are. But as soon as you're like Poilievre and your name recognition is approaching 100%, an endorsement doesn't really do anything anymore. That's why Trump endorsing somebody in the US can actually matter quite a lot because he's usually endorsing people of nearly 0 name recognition. But someone endorsing Trump basically has no input.
Yeah, it's like a senator in a state endorsing him, like maybe gets him another like 5,000 voters. Like it's nothing. It's like literally decimal points. It's not exactly the 5-point bump that you wanted. And sometimes endorsements, it's like it's more so what that candidate needs from the people who are on the fence. It's mostly about on the fence people, and on the fence people are a very niche group of people. And if that endorsement does not meet those niche group of people's like, it doesn't sort of satisfy their concerns, then it doesn't matter. So actually, I do seek endorsements for my riding, and in a certain sense, this sounds very abstract and meta, but I'm looking for endorsements that kind of age me up a little bit in people's minds because I'm 24, and so I don't want like a student union president endorsing me because who cares? It just sounds like I must have gone to school with the guy or something like that. Whereas someone like I have gotten, like Dan McTeague and Drew Barnes, well, they're like older politicians that people remember from Wild Rose or from like, the old Chrétien Liberal Party, but Dan McTeague's like a super big oil and gas guy. So like no one's going to then attach their like that liking to me, but it's like, oh, some older politicians were willing to endorse him, and there's maybe like 50 people in my riding who that will matter to when they like look through like an endorsements page on my website. It's going to be super, super tiny.
Yeah. And your case is the prime example of when endorsements even like remotely marginally matter. Because prior to your YouTube channel, you would have basically zero name recognition. So then an endorsement, someone endorsing you gives you a little bit of name recognition by proxy. Not a lot.
It's also, and sometimes an endorsement, you actually want kind of the out of the box endorsement. Either someone's so big that you're like, wow, why would that person endorse them? Or it's like, oh, why would that person endorse them? Because I wouldn't expect that. You know what I mean? Like, you get endorsed by someone who's like, an independent who used to be NDP, but kind of has some more conservative leanings now, or something like that. Like something where it's like, wow, that kind of really demonstrates that you can work with like if your idea is like, well, this person's really, really conservative, like, oh, are they too conservative for this area? And like a perfect endorsement would be someone that the Conservative Party, all like the base really likes, but also is associated with being a little bit more center, would be like a Melissa Lantsman endorsement would actually probably be really helpful in certain ridings, either with ridings with a strong Jewish community or in ridings where you actually want to demonstrate that you can like tack to the middle a little bit depending on the issue. And so like a Melissa Lantsman endorsement would be her saying, yeah, I can work with this person. That person's not, some sort of like hard-edged person who wants to get into fights with anyone who's not as conservative as they are.
A really good recent example in Canada of like an endorsement I think actually genuinely mattered was in 2022. I don't recall the exact union, but a bunch of big unions in Ontario endorsed Ford. And that's kind of an outside the box weird thing, because how often do you expect unions to want to endorse the conservative candidate? Just bring it up here.
What it did for a lot of people is it kind of cut off the search that they were on for a party, because there's a lot of voters in 2022 in Ontario who didn't really know where they were going to settle their vote, because the Liberals looked disorganized, the NDP looked disorganized, but I don't like Ford. And then your kind of union gives you permission to stop kind of caring about the election. Just go with Ford, he's fine.
Yeah,
and
actually,
that's actually the effect you want. You don't want people to be like jazzed up about it. You actually just kind of want members to be like, yeah, fair enough. You don't need much more than that. You just need people to be like, fair enough. I'm not going to vote because he's probably going to win anyways. I'll stay home. Or, fair enough. I guess I can go show up and vote for him because I don't really want to have to keep hearing about Del Duca and Horvath.
There's actually quite a few unions, actually. The IBEW, the HVAC union, the IBB, the IUPAT, the IUOE, the LUNA, the APO, OPSWA, the Ontario Pipe Trades Council, the Residential Construction Council, the International Association of Sheet Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation Work. Like, there's a lot of unions that endorsed him. And that kind of stuff, as Wyatt was saying, that matters in that case, because it's kind of outside the box, and lets people be like, oh, okay.
And they also have a membership list, and they will email their entire membership list of people who are, because it's a union, forced to sign up and work with them. So yeah, like that's where it matters, is when they also come with data of their own.
Yeah.
That's why interest groups matter, because they have their 150 people in your riding who are going to show up and maybe even volunteer.
Yeah.
So actually, here's a good example. That's why like most people would have a negative impression of him if you did a poll. That's why David Parker is effective in Alberta. He doesn't need to be liked by more than his, small percentage of followers. And when I say small percentage, I don't mean like, oh, like nobody likes you, blah, blah. I just mean in terms of like the 4%, 5% of Albertans he can polarize on something. That's all he needs, and that's all you would maybe need. So you might even be willing to take on the negative association. But he comes with, in your riding, maybe 600 members if you're running for like a UCP nomination. And so literally it doesn't even matter if the endorsement is somebody who anybody likes. It can literally be somebody that is infamous, but they have reach.
There's actually an interesting tangent about David Parker there. A lot of people I interact with on a regular basis are really confused why Smith tolerates David Parker, because he's kind of a loose cannon in some ways. And they're like, wow, why doesn't Smith just fire him or get rid of him or alienate him or just like minimize him. It's like, well, when you have a guy who has actual real political power, such as an organization, people he has names and contacts and will go out and vote or go to nomination meetings and stuff like that, you can't just alienate that guy. And it, if you remember, or the viewers, if you go back to my older videos, I think it was my second last BC video, I was touching on like the hierarchy of political factions. And in the case of Alberta, David Parker is a perfect example of a high-ranking lieutenant in the Alberta Conservative faction. He might be the oddball or the infamous one that no one really wants to officially be friends with, but he commands enough power that you can't ignore him. You can't get mad at him. You can't have him against you, or else he will do what he did to Kenny, and he will get all his people to go out and tip the scale against him.
Yeah, well, here's a strange example too. I was just searching up because I thought it was a good example of like a super niche community that people will court simply because it comes with votes. Like, I think it was Tom Bradley in the Los Angeles mayoral election in 1973 courted the Jim Jones People's Temple cult because it comes with 3,000 votes, and in a mayoral election, 3,000 votes really does matter.
Yeah, that is a very niche example.
Yeah, and he actually got onto like a board in like the county that they were in simply because they were actually going to show up and vote. Or they might be San Francisco. I think it might have been actually Dianne Feinstein who worked with them.
The exact person is not super relevant, but yeah, that's kind of the interesting thing. That to just go back to the main topic at hand, like most announcements that happen, or most micro scandals that pop up, really don't matter because they don't. There's this interesting thing.
It has to say something fundamental about the character of the person or the party to matter. If it just feels like a fluke, it doesn't matter.
Like a good example is this is like you had Poilievre's Apple video, and obviously that wasn't a minor scandal or anything because that was quite a popular video, but the Liberals tried to use that and say, look at all the like he says a lot of things and that are kind of like Trump. Blah, 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 blah. And then you kind of look at this a few months down the line, and you look at now in 2024, most recent polls on this, and then you compare it back to like 2021, Trump's approval rating in Canada is increasing. And it's increasing because one of the corollaries to something like this is if you're comparing someone who's well-liked by a percentage of the population to someone else that they don't like, usually what's going to happen is you're actually going to make them like that other person. Because it's really hard to make someone dislike someone they currently like.
Well, and if anything, they're kind of giving the game away a little bit in the sense that Trump has a very negative impression because the media simply hates him and they tell people to hate him. So then when they start trying to apply it to somebody that people don't really have that fundamental hate for, they're like, oh, okay, so this is basically, yeah, I'm not trying to sound conspiratorial about it, but it's basically just an op, almost. It's just like Operation Hate Conservatives.
Yeah.
Here, we've trained you to hate this guy, now hate this guy. And it's like, oh, well, was I being told to hate the previous guy for false reasons too?
And that's kind of what it boils down to with most. How do I want to phrase this? So, like, if we go back to my heuristic I said earlier, right? So, if no one this is especially useful if you canvass doors because you get it. I agree with you on this, Wyatt, that I don't want to just always bring back to canvassing or anything, but
yeah, go try canvassing people.
But if you canvass doors, it's a really easy example of this because people will tell you the things that are on their mind or the things that they have absorbed from the current political climate. On Saturday when I was canvassing, what did I see? People were talking to me about either yes or no carbon tax and literally nothing else. Other than those two people I mentioned earlier. No one else said anything of any note about conservative politics. It was the conservative policies. There was those two guys who had a big conversation with, and there was people saying, yeah, kill the carbon tax, or no, I like the carbon tax. That was it. And it's like, wow.
And that's actually the problem in my area, is that I have to actually kind of get people off of the carbon tax, because the problem with the carbon tax is it's the greatest subsidy ever for shallow, red Tory type nomination candidates. They get to run against just a tax and people love them for it. Wow. You know what I mean? So I have to be like, every single one of these people is going to say they're going to get scrap the carbon tax. Literally day one of conservative government, the carbon tax is going to be gone and Justin Trudeau is going to be gone. So right now, if their local nomination platform is, oh, I dislike Justin Trudeau, I dislike his carbon tax, well, that's a great subsidy to them, because that means after day one of a conservative government, they don't have to do a single thing if they're your MP, because they've achieved 100% of their goals, because their goals were purely shallow. And then I bring up a bunch of other issues that none of these people ever talk about on their websites, because, it's controversial. And that might mean that people don't like them at every single door. And although the problem with this is that because every single one of them is saying, I'm going to get rid of the carbon tax, I don't like Trudeau, I mean, they all start sounding very generic, which is why that one guy described that one guy's email sent to him by another candidate was like flatulence. It was just, I've been working in whatever industry for this amount of time, and I don't like Trudeau and his carbon tax, and I'm Team Polyev, which is very funny because this guy was Team Charest and then Team O'Toole and all this other stuff.
And that kind of goes back to, I think, something I said in the last video in the series. And I immediately lost my train of thought.
That's the problem with this. That's the problem with doing these podcasts this long. Eventually, like, we have like thoughts from 10 minutes ago we're trying to remember.
Yeah, what was it? Nope. Can't pull the words together.
You'll get there. But anyways, yeah, I think I'll jog your memory. I think I was talking about the whole idea of running on these simple problems.
Oh, yes, you do jog my memory.
There you go.
So there's this heuristic that a lot, or heuristic is one word, to go back to like sort of touching on when you're talking about the approval ratings, which I kind of still have on screen here. People have this deathly fear of saying something slightly unpopular or slightly against the consensus. Now, don't get me wrong, you don't want to be too far outside of normal, because that's also bad. But you don't want to be too much inside normal, because then you're just generic and no one really knows what you stand for. Because it's the small principled things that depart from the center, depart from normal, that let people actually understand what you are. An example of Polyev, because it's really easy. He's really hard and really deep into anti-safe supply. He's even saying he wants to sue big pharma companies for Oxycontin and stuff like that. Like, that's way out of left field for a conservative. That's not normally a thing that they go super deep hard into. Drug policy, like the finer details of how you do drug policy, is like one of their main campaign platforms, one of their main campaign things. But that actually really helps sell Polyev to people, because it gives him a very, in that regard, in that particular case, a very compassionate side in how he phrases it, and it makes it a very good, easy issue, because most people aren't really comfortable with safe supply to begin with. And then
but it's one of those things that people think of as like, yeah, a niche side issue that nobody cares about. It's again, it's even Danielle Smith in the 23 provincial election, even though I don't think the UCP ran a very good campaign. I think one policy that was surprisingly popular for them, it wasn't surprising to me. I was actually advocating the background for them to actually start like gunning on this thing, but involuntary commitment of drug addicts. Mm-hmm. Because when people in downtown Calgary are like riding the train and they're seeing people who legitimately can't stand up using like heroin and like fentanyl on the streets, yeah, it actually becomes an appealing policy, no matter how liberal you are on other issues, that probably these people should be, probably forced to detox and then housed somewhere for several months to sort of like reintegrate. That's actually like a paradigm breaking policy stance, where the person stops caring about the tax policy and a lot of other sort of like service policy, as long as you follow through on that thing. That's the same thing with Blaine Higgs in New Brunswick, and I don't think he's taking these stances for simply strategic reasons, but parental rights was probably like the secret sauce that he needed in order to likely win this next provincial election. Is that he needed something that made it so that people would stop focusing on the economic pain that, frankly, the New Brunswick government has to cause right now in order to get their finances back into line. But that was the one thing where it's like, okay, let's stop talking about finances. Let's talk about parental rights and the way that schools with a lot of activists are trying to monopolize more and more of children's upbringing into the classroom.
And that's actually both of those policies that you just touched on. So obviously the safe supply stuff and the specifically involuntary commitment of drug addicts too, but say parental rights stuff. Why those matter so much right now for the Conservatives to have policies like those, and it really boils down. I touched on this in my last video. What it seems to be the status quo that's going on polling wise, which says a lot of things about the underlying behavior and attitudes of voters, is the rural areas are rapidly polarizing to the right. Then the suburbs and the urban areas are like more normal, if that makes sense. So they're more chugging along roughly around, like, if the Conservatives are at 42%, they're around 42% range, right? But the rurals are going way off. Super right wing. And that's great if you're doing popular, if you're decisively winning elections, right? Because you have a 20-point vote lead like Poilievre does. That's great. If you're Danielle Smith and you only have an 8-point lead and you're running up a 40-point margin in rural Alberta, you need to win the outer core of Calgary. You need to win, hopefully, the outer core of Edmonton, which is very difficult, but anyways. You need to win the outer cores of these big cities because otherwise you lose the election. You can only... It doesn't matter if you have the popular vote lead if all of your votes are in the wrong areas.
And that's where I think we both oppose proportional representation. I actually think it is fundamentally fair that you have to both represent some amount of geography as well as popularity overall in a province or any jurisdiction you want to represent. If anything, I think we probably both endorse an electoral college style way of pushing away a representation. That I think geography and population should be the combination of where we put representatives.
My main 2 cents on that is I genuinely agree with how the status quo works. There's a little bit of nuance.
And I'm not someone who needs to change the status quo.
But
it's perfectly fine right now.
My main thing with electoral systems, and based on my research and all that stuff, right, is I don't, outside of some minor arbitrage that happens right after you change the system, because the person who changes the system usually changes it for their own benefit. So there's a minor arbitrage factor that happens right then. But as long as voters have adapted to that system and are used to it and operating within the confines of that new system you've adopted, I don't think it actually changes the outcome of elections. It changes the behavior of parties, but not the outcome of elections.
That's the thing, is I've seen that in every, no matter what system, and this is just voter choice theory like we did in our previous episode, no matter what system you choose, everything will generally triangulate to the exact same type of result. The makeup of the parties might look different, but effectively all you end up doing with proportional representation is kicking factions out of parties and then having them start their own party, and they win the exact same seats they would have occupied if they were just a faction operating inside of the original party. So yeah, they win by slimmer margins overall because it's now proportionally representative, but the party would still end up selecting the same people to sit in those seats. And so the NDP Socialist Caucus would just run a socialist party and they would win 4 seats and they would end up caucusing with the NDP anyways. And if anything, we just end up wasting a lot more money on politics by having every party with the base costs associated with running it requiring way more donations from the people who currently support it.
Yeah, like a good example of this. So let's pick a riding near near where I live in. Let's pick South Shore St. Margaret's. In that riding, if you blew up the Conservative Party in, say, party list, open party list proportional, you're gonna have your social conservative faction. You're gonna have your more generic conservative faction that's like not super social conservative, but not social conservative, not super you know what I mean. You're gonna have like your libertarian guys. You're gonna have your like fishing village guys who are kind of similar to the inner core conservatives I said earlier, which are kind of like a little more populisty. And they're gonna be like 4 different parties, and then They'll win the seat. One of those four parties will win the seat, or the whatever. You know what I mean? They're like STV, for example. Better way to say. They'll still win that seat. One of those four parties, and it'll be basically the same thing it was before. Whereas now in our current system, what happens is the nomination race is just that.
Well, and what it does is that the great thing about first past the post is that it forces smaller parties to figure out whether they want to merge or dissolve faster, because you can't just kind of hang on as a legacy forever with their kind of default voters who will show up for you every election, being able to keep you with one or two seats. Because social credit would easily still be around if we had proportional representation in Alberta. Nobody really wants them. There's no real purpose behind the party. But, I've been voting for that party for 30 years, so I'm going to keep voting for them for another 60 years. And you just have them always winning like 5, 7, 8% of the vote and winning their 8% of the seats. And it would just be worthless because those voters could easily find a home in another party if the party just dissolved. And first past the post basically forces them to figure it out and leave. And so right now the PPC has no purpose. In 21, they almost worked themselves out a niche where they could actually have something to say in politics past just campaign rhetoric, because I think there's a difference between having something to say in terms of electoral campaign rhetoric and actually having something to say in terms of something to say in Parliament. And I think since the 21 election, now it would have been stupid if we had proportional representation. They had 5% of the seats in the last election, but now, even though there's no purpose in really voting for them over voting for Polyev because he's improved the party and moved them back to the right after O'Toole, and so there's really no niche that the PPC fully occupies. They only occupy a more intense version. They would still be persisting with 3% of the seats in the federal parliament.
Yeah. That's a good summation. They're basically, the way I see it is, at the end of the day, voters vote in the system to get the result they want. So if the population in Canada, if we scroll back up here, if 58%, there's a better way to phrase this, if 58% of them don't like the government, in first past the post, as it is in Canada, that means you need to be like 40% of the population to vote for the Conservative Party. Great. If we were in a different system, you're probably going to have 58% of the people voting for parties that will happily form a coalition. So instead of having the Conservatives win with 40%, they'll have like a coalition that's like 58% of the population. But in the end of the day, it's the same difference, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like governments form at the exact same rate. Like you'd have to find micro examples where governments in proportional and first past the post systems don't form pretty much the exact same unless there's micro issues on the ground, like in Israel, where there's so many very strange factions of voters that naturally governments fall apart really fast. Like most proportional representation systems have governments that last the normal 4-year term, just like they do in first past the post, and the coalitions do not separate, and they could have easily just been in the same party, and the nomination race would have just determined what kind of representative you would have. You could say that the nomination system in Canada could be overhauled, where there should be a little bit more reliance on Elections Canada to monitor these things to make sure that the result that's happening in the riding is the result people wanted, rather than just some random insider, like some returning officer for whatever party, like the PC party of Ontario under Patrick Brown's a great example. The returning officer, what they said and what the actual vote was like two completely different things. So if we had like Elections Ontario monitoring that, maybe you'd have more blue Conservatives in ridings where the population wanted them. But that's the only real thing you could change in the system. And that is a problem that would still exist in the proportional representation system. There would still be nominations. There would still be party lists and whatnot. And even when people have countered me saying, well, it wouldn't be a pure list system, and then they have to say, well, it'd be a regional list system, or even a more regionalist system, it just still becomes that party. It would actually give party elites way more power, because you can't be an out-of-the-box candidate that nobody really thought would win, and then you worked hard enough to get yourself in Parliament. You might be in a region where there's 5 seats, but you always get put at the bottom of the list because they can manipulate it in such a way where the party favorites who've been around for 30 years always get the top spots, rather than, hey, out of those 5 ridings, you were the ones who worked hardest, people liked you, and you won.
Yeah, I mean, you compare, say, the Netherlands to, say, the U.S. The U.S. primary system means that Congress Like, even in ridings that are deep red or deep blue, there's still like a real election that happens every single election because it's now just the primary. And a lot of people understand this and will just register Democrat or register Republican so they can vote for the nomination race there and then vote for their
Yeah.
candidate, the actual party they identify with in the general.
My riding is exactly that. It is a primary election, effectively.
And
It is literally the most, I believe, maybe not every election, but it has been in the past the most blue suburban riding in the country. Like, especially in the early 2000s, they would win with 75% of the vote, which is like unheard of for a suburban riding.
that's crazy. So what that means is that the individual congressperson now actually has a lot of latitude to do whatever they want. And that's one of the reasons why the U.S. Congress is so much more chaotic and vote records matter so much more because individual congressmen have way more latitude of action because they are elected on their own merit. They're not like Canada. In a lot of cases, not always, but a lot of cases, party leaders will just appoint someone as the candidate. Or they'll thumb their finger on the scale of the nomination race. And it's like, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, this is the candidate. The U.S. doesn't have that. It's entirely base choosing it, or the members of the party choosing it. And since it's run through the U.S. Election states or whatever, their state agencies, in principle, everyone who's a registered Republican is voting in that primary. Whereas, say, Halifax West, unless you are politically active and buy membership in the Conservative Party, the nomination is probably only going to be like a 200 or 300 people voting.
That's actually something that I could say that, like, you could say, like, legitimately, in a certain sense, the media rigs nominations in Canada. Because if you're being paid taxpayer money to cover the news and you don't cover nominations, like, wow, that's actually kind of like an actual dereliction of duty. The one thing that Canadians definitely need to know more about, that there is an actual very important local election happening in their area. It's just like, oh, we're not going to cover it. It's niche. It's within one party. I'm like, yeah, also determining who the MP is.
But
Even
then,
if it's a more divided riding, it still determines who the MP is going to be because it determines who the guy, the Liberal, the Conservatives or the NDP are running in this potentially very split riding.
but then if you look at, say, the Netherlands with their party list system, there is no latitude of action. If you are a oddball MP in the Netherlands, or whatever they call their legislators, either you have to break away and make your own party, or you'll get thrown to the bottom of the party list and probably not get elected again. So it encourages everyone to either splinter into a million tiny parties, which happens in the Netherlands.
Oh, and first you even have to be approved to be on the list, and then you get to be approved what position you get put on the list. And, like, in a certain sense, and it's not that it's just a corruption. It's just logical that you're going to put the stalwarts at the top. But
Yeah.
maybe the stalwarts are the problem, and so nothing ever gets solved because you're always going to be catering to your long-termers.
And what that ends up meaning is the members of the political parties in, say, the Netherlands or other systems like that either had to be stalwart loyal to the party or immediately defect and make their own party. And in the Netherlands, that works out because there is no vote threshold. So as long as you get enough votes to win a seat, you win a seat. But in something like Germany, if you can't get 5% of the vote in Germany, it doesn't matter what you did. You don't get a seat.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you actually won the local riding, but that's pretty difficult because usually the CDU just wins all of those anyways.
Yeah. That's the funny thing, is that, like, everyone's always, like, talking about, like, well, this system's better than this one. Like, if the system, to be as fair as humanly possible, requires this many rules and this many contingencies, I think that I like the idea that you know, to quote Donald Trump, you vote and you win, and whoever gets the most votes just wins in the specific area.
I think part of the reason why election systems become like a really popular topic for people, especially online, to talk about, is it's just kind of the people who are on, like, say, Twitter are usually skew way more wonkish than the average person, and usually skew left wing, though not entirely, because there's some right wingers who care about who want to change electoral systems. But a lot of it is kind of like this idea in this thought. It's like we can make the country will be so much better if we can just elect people in the correct way. And it's like, but why?
Yeah, it doesn't change anyone's attitudes about government.
Like, why is the government going to be substantially better because now we have 10 micro parties? I'm not going to say it's worse, but it's probably not better. It's probably going to be the same thing. It's just different. It's different but the same. Though with that there, I think that would be a good time to wrap up here. So if you guys like this video, by all means comment below and do all your YouTube things like share, subscribe, and all that. Good feedback on the last one, and more feedback, and we'll keep doing these. Anything you'd like to say before we sign off here?
I think it's been fun to talk a little bit more in depth, and I know a lot of people have said that in their podcasts. Oh, it's great to talk for whatever amount of time, but I think that talking about something in a way that's actually productive in learning how politics works. It's not because we're gurus and we're so wise, but it's just being more pragmatic about how you actually interact in the system. Because I find honestly most podcasts tend to be receptacles of people just mouthing off about whatever their opinions are and why people need to adopt their opinions. This whole podcast's thesis is that don't think that way.
Yes. Okay, so see you guys next week with some video of some form. What was that? We bid you adieu.